Hello and welcome to Climb's podcast series Advancing Vietnam with me, Vlad Savin, as your host. Throughout the following episodes, we're looking to answering relevant questions about doing business in Vietnam. What are the opportunities and challenges faced by investors entering the market or existing players in major industries? We will seek to understand the business environment from a cultural, local mindset and how to deal with compliance from an international perspective. What are the major risks faced by businesses active in the region and how to overcome them? We will dive deep into the compliance environment in Vietnam, discussing processes and procedures, changes in laws, latest official updates from the authorities, and financial governance planning for businesses active in Vietnam. We at the Climb consider compliance a major asset for foreign investors operating in Vietnam. We emphasize this aspect when speaking with our clients, and we make sure they understand the significant benefits of being compliant. In this episode, I'm discussing with Matthew Lowry, managing partner at a Climb Vietnam, about the practical requirements, best practices, and legal framework for employing foreign experts in Vietnam. Matthew, welcome again to Advancing Vietnam podcast series. This topic is highly interesting and timely, considering after March 2022, with the opening of Vietnam's borders, we saw a lot of FDI, and as well, together with the FDI, a lot of foreign experts entering again into Vietnam.
Great to be here and look forward to talking about it.
Let's start first with understanding the commercial needs from a public and private perspective regarding bringing foreign experts into Vietnam. Is there at this point in time a specific need for foreign experts into Vietnam, and is the Vietnamese government supporting and enabling companies to bring these foreign experts seamlessly?
It's a really good foundation question to start with, because there is a need, but there's also a political and an economic issue, and they always compete with each other. And the laws are written around, there is a need. So let's just put there's a foundation and there's a structure for it. You've got this economy which has looked for foreign investment for many years and looked for that foreign expertise. So where there is an expert and foreign investment and growth opportunities, yes, that foreign expertise is encouraged and permitted and endorsed as part of the process. Where a Vietnamese individual can do the job, or there isn't a need of that experience or that level, there's pushback, there's restrictions. So the law is written that a foreign expert must have experience and qualifications. Now, sometimes this is taken too far, and we can talk about that later on, but the fundamentals is if a foreign expert has the qualifications and experience, yes, they can definitely work. And we can talk later too, but there's no quotas. It's not about quotas. It's about the commercial needs for a business. Contrast that with where the laws and have been pushed, and where a lot of the discussion in recent times have been about difficulties and issues. We compete that with the cheap labour. A lot of the unqualified school teachers, particularly the English language teachers, which were coming in for certain sectors, a lot of the cheap Chinese labour crossing the border, working for projects, trying to stop that, trying to make that more difficult and trying to prevent what are jobs that can be fulfilled by Vietnamese or by qualified experts, qualified foreign individuals coming in. So so the foundation is there. There's no issue with foreign employees. There's an issue with unqualified and those where there is not a commercial need.
Mm-hmm. Let's look then at the qualified and the commercial need for foreign employees and how they can enter Vietnam. What would be the processes, looking at first the visa requirements and then the work permit requirements? What is that step-by-step process that investors should know for bringing those stuff in?
So you deal with visa later. Even though it's the first step in the application, you have to make sure that it's worthwhile. If you start a visa process and then you can't actually meet the requirements, you've wasted your time. And you don't want to make an employment offer for someone who can't be working legally in Vietnam. So let's look at the working part.
What are the basic requirements for the staff to be able to work?
So your first is a number of different categories, but your first one is a foreign expert with university degree and 3 years senior experience relevant to that role. Now, the degree should be relevant for the role. Then there have been periods where that's interpreted, but from a safety perspective, a degree relevant for the role, and you can always play with the title and job title to be flexible to fit in. It's just a commercial reality. But a degree relevant for the role and 3 years commercial experience. That experience needs to be evidenced, and it can be in Vietnam if there's a work permit, but that's the first part. If it's the head of the organisation, they can not have a degree, they can have 5 years experience. There is a subtly different if it's an internal transfer. They've worked for more than 12 months, and there is a possibility, but the rules don't change significantly. A couple of easier processes. And the last one is if there's a technical expert. They've got a technical experience in a particular defined area, role, or process. You can engage with the authorities about relying upon that technical expertise. So if there's a particular production line, machine that is needed, you can still get by for a specific technical skill. It's not a blanket, it is quite defined, but it does work as well.
So now then, the foreign investor did already a basic assessment of the requirements for a foreign individual that they want to employ. Things are clear. What is the next step for them to bring them into the country and enable them to work in Vietnam?
The way the law's written and what happens in practice are two different things at the moment. Post-COVID, when we reopen, they have not enacted all of the visa, the previous process. In fact, the law as it's written says you can get a tourist visa, come in and convert that visa to a employment or a business process. They're not issuing tourist visas. E-visas for tourists, which aren't actually tourist visas. So there's a subtle that the law is not as clear, it's not being implemented. So what that means for employers is that they either need to do the process before someone comes, which is difficult to get the full work permit and get a temporary resident card or a visa fully before they come. What the authorities are, which is not, I don't believe is in line with the laws, what the authorities are doing at the moment and what they're requesting, so if the authorities require it, and this is the process nearly everyone's going through, is that they enter Vietnam on a sponsored business visa, 3-month business visa, sponsored by and for the purpose of applying for a work permit and getting the documents in order. And that allows the individual to enter Vietnam. They're sponsored by the business to be providing those activities in country, and therefore that buys time. Now, we'll touch on in a moment, should they be working on that business visa without the work permit? We'll touch on, but the authorities are expecting them to come in for the purposes of, on a business visa, to get the documents. If someone can't get the process done in 3 months, they are allowing extensions on an ad hoc basis. If someone can show that in good faith they're partway through the process and there's been a stall or an issue somewhere, they are extending, but it's not a guaranteed that it will extend. So you've got 3 months to get everything done. Once you have that work permit, you can then apply for a temporary resident card for 2 years to match your work permit, or a visa to match that work permit once it comes. So the 3 months is the enter, and 3 months to sort yourself out and get everything all documented.
Right. And looking at the work permit now, can you quickly explain on what's the process of obtaining the work permit for an individual, and also touch a bit on the exemptions? We've seen there's quite a large cases where investors and employees can get exemptions for work permits, even with the new Decree 152. Foreign experts with Vietnamese spouses, they can even get exemption from the work permit exemption, which is as well something pretty unusual within the legal system. Can you explain more about that?
An exemption. So you've got, the primary process is that there's 2 stages. One, the employer needs approval for that role. So that's, as I said at the start, that's evidence of need. And there's a prescribed timeline. Most provinces actually do that far quicker to be in practice, where you apply, and you may need to show that you've made an effort and can't find that locally. But as a general rule, if it is a foreign expert, your role you're seeking is foreign expert, the authorities just go through that process and approve and let you recruit that, because that's their commercial. They really look at it from a commerciality point of view. If it quacks like a duck or walks like a duck, it's a duck. They're not crazy when it looks, they understand. And this is where, if you know the person that you want, there's no point applying for a different and getting approval to hire a different role. You will get rejected when you apply. So you need to make sure that the first step, that the role you're seeking approval for matches the candidate, if you have a candidate already. Otherwise, or you'll know you can get candidates who meet the requirements for the specifics of what you're putting down. So step 1, the authorities approve the recruitment of a foreign individual. Step 2 is the individual's documents are submitted for the individual to be approved for that role. So that step 1, step 2. Step 1 is the company docs, and the job description. Step 2 is the individual that meets the requirements of that approval. Now the exemption. So the requirements are, first of all, You must have university degree, experience letter, health check, and criminal check. You must submit them and must be notarized and legalized in foreign countries, and that can be cumbersome. So exemptions can be useful. There's an exemption for, this is where I said before there's a slight conflict, but the exemption in law as written now and also Decree 152 is that if you enter for less than 30 days at a time and less than 90 days in a year, you're exempt from work permit. You can come here, do activities, be employed or engaged for your labour by a local entity and paid, and you do not require a work permit. So that's the exemption that exists. And so someone who's coming in for short periods, the 90-day continuous is technically not in the current law or decree. It was in the old one. But that is still, as I said, the authorities are sort of treating that as an exemption to enable you to get your documents together. So it's just sort of an interesting grey area. The exemptions come in where you've got that short stay exemption, and you've got exemptions for foreign lawyers if they're Ministry of Justice. You've got exemptions for those who invest more than 130,000 in a company can be exempt from a work permit. But you still need to get the exemption certificate. So that's the key part. If you're a foreign lawyer, if you're exempt because of it, you're an owner of a business and have got considerable capital in that business, you need to get an exemption certificate, which looks like a work permit. It's same. It's still stage 1, stage 2. The second stage, you're submitting separate documents to say you don't need all the docs. I'm exempt, but you still need that. So either you get the step 1, step 2, you get a work permit, or step 1 or 2, you get a work permit exemption certificate. The one thing that you mentioned before, the sort of the exemption from the exemption, a foreign individual married to a Vietnamese and registered as a resident here is able for a work permit exemption, and that exemption is they're exempt from the exemption certificate. And one other thing is that it means that they can actually be treated as a Vietnamese employee for indefinite contracts and other things like that. So it has another little quirk that in law. So there's good and bad from an employer's perspective.
And how long does this entire process take, looking from a practical perspective, not necessarily what the authorities are undertaking with their own processes? So from the moment where the investor realizes that this is the right candidate for them until they can actually sign a labor contract, in your experience, how long would they assume that they should take?
And I'll just touch on the last part first, is you can't sign a labour contract until you have a work permit. That's the way the law's written, which makes that first thing of coming here, doing some work before your contract quite hard to put in practice. And again, there's workarounds, but it's not the way the law is written. So the law says I can only sign a contract once I have a work permit or an exemption for that individual, and before that, it is illegal. That's the law, and that's sort of very clear how it's written, which means that you have to plan. The timing, depending on how you overlap, if you've got the approval to hire and then you find someone to submit straight away versus find someone, then seek approval to hire, that can slow it down. And given that the visas are taking a few weeks or more to arrange the visa, you could have a visa, a approval and work permit. It could be a 12-week process. It could be a 6-week process for a new employee. It can, depending upon how you, but if you don't allow, if you are simply going, oh, I want that person, they're out of the country, how do I bring that person in? It's probably 12 weeks to do that. If you've already have gone, you're making you've got the job description approved, you've got the approval from the authorities, and you're trying to find the right candidate, and you identify them, and they've got the documents available already, it could be a 6-week process or less to have them in country working with a labour contract. But it's not something that you can just get that person, they can start next week. That is not a position that you would ever encourage someone to take the assumption with.
And you mentioned before about labor contracts. Maybe we can speak a bit about them, especially for foreign employees, how they work in practice, and as well clarifying a bit on how that labor contract or how that employment endeavor of the employee can happen within this time frame from the moment of arriving into Vietnam until they actually have the work permit and they're able to sign a contract. Can they do a probation, or what's the practical process there?
The way it is intended to work and had worked pre-COVID, and the law's written, is that you cannot undertake work or be paid without having a work permit or an exemption certificate. or exempt from an exemption. So you have your work, you have a labour contract, you're going to be paid. You're an employee, and that labour contract can only be no longer than your work permit. So you're generally working at, most foreign employees, a 2-year work permit with a 2-year labour contract with a 2-year temporary resident visa sitting in there, and after 2 years there's a renewal. You can renew it once and then you have to reapply. So you get a 4-year double cycle is the expectation. That's the way it should work. We've seen complications in the past, but that's the way it should work. The working without a labour contract is a grey area, and that's the difficulty. And because the authorities have made it more complicated and slowed the process down somewhat and haven't fully implemented everything the way we would normally expect. And by the way, the business chambers are still raising this and dealing with issues with the authorities saying you've got to get that balance right. The balance isn't quite right. Because of that, you would need to have a consulting contract or similar, which can be deemed to be a labour contract. So it's an area where, I'll be honest, I can't give the certainty of what that process pre-labour contract should be. That's not that is compliant, because the process is vague, and in my view, it's not compliant. But the authorities are encouraging and treating and deeming sort of this grey area as, we'll look over that. We won't worry about that, provided you make every effort and do it properly. We're sort of going to just ignore it. That's the impression we get. There's nothing in writing to say that. The risk from an employer is that they don't deem it like that. So if we take the path of, you make an offer to someone, they accept, they get the documents, they send it over, you get the work permit, you arrange it before they arrive, you then sponsor their visa, then they can enter. That is the way it should be. It's not the way it works for most cases right now, but that's the way it should be.
And looking at the terms of labor contracts, are they different, or are there significant variations for a foreign employee versus a local employee within the labor contract?
The contract itself is the same, except they must be a fixed 2-year, where Vietnamese can have up to 3 years, 3 years, and then indefinite. In fact, you have longer than 3 years, but there's more flexibility in the Vietnamese contract. But a foreign individual with a work permit or an exemption is entitled to other benefits, such as education exemptions for their children, majority exemptions on rental accommodation provided by the employer, 1 trip home per year. There's some exemptions, so you need to build them into your processes. But other than that, the contracts are the same. They're enforced and treated the same. And labour law, the bulk of labour law doesn't distinguish, and the bulk of labour law treats labour and employment as being the same.
And what we find in discussions with investors is that, especially international investors, they assume they can use a standard pre-arranged by their legal counsel in Singapore or in Berlin, a standard labor contract, and then they can implement it, sign it with whoever they want in Vietnam. What are the risks for this practice?
We do see that. You see that we've engaged and signed a contract in Singapore, and you go to Vietnam, we don't need to sign a new contract because the same contract can apply, or re-sign that contract. It needs to be a contract valid under Vietnamese laws. It needs to be relevant for Vietnamese labour code. And Vietnamese labour code, and I refer to workers, it's written about workers, not employees. It's written, and the labour system still is heavily dependent on its roots, which is this socialist, factory worker protection, unionist type approach. So it is quite likely that a foreign contract is in breach and contradicts in many ways and potentially not valid. In fact, it should be in Vietnamese. The labour law does allow, the latest labour law, which came in a couple of years ago, does allow email labour contracts. It doesn't have to be signed. It can be offer and acceptance. There can be a number of ways to do it. We always suggest in writing, dual language, and make sure, and to back to your point, make sure it's locally compliant with the labour law. And many foreign jurisdictions will have contradictions and potential illegalities in respect to their standard wording at a group level that will not be appropriate. You can still have a master labour contract, subcontract them to Vietnam in essence, and carve them out, and keep an active offshore holding structure in place, so when they finish their Vietnamese contract, it can revert back to their foreign contract. You've got to structure that. But if they're in Vietnam, working in Vietnam, you should have a Vietnamese compliant contract to work with that may not necessarily meet their foreign contract conditions in the same way in every respect.
Also, when speaking with the international investors, we sometimes find, not often, but sometimes we find that they do employ certain individuals on a medium to long term without having a work permit. And there's many reasons for it. It's impossible for them to get a work permit, even though they have qualifications, but they cannot prove, or other specific issues for that company. What would be those risks for the individual and for the company where they have a practice, not just 1 or 2 months before you get the work permit, but it is in essence up to a year, 2 years of employment, but there's no work permit to sustain it?
Yeah, but the inspections when it happens, it's quite interesting where there's a number of different paths they can go down, and the inspectors, and it depends on how they deem and what they look and how you're otherwise compliance. They can deport individuals, they can fine significant amounts of money for the employer, they can non-deduct, all your expenses are non-deductible in respect to that, so it's non-tax deductible, which can be a killer if you're paying high salaries, that you've got to pay no deductions for anything and pay additional taxes. And you can be banned from employing other foreigners. So there is that implication, and the foreign individual being kicked out and not being permitted to enter Vietnam, the employer not being able to sponsor any visas, it can cause, if you're a large employer, significant problems, but financially it will hurt. But more importantly is once they find you've done one thing wrong, they will go through everything, and they'll try to find as many things wrong with your labour system as they possibly can. Another implication is, we've seen this, is the individuals paid from offshore, they're not paid from Vietnam. Well, the authorities can still deem them being employed and working, but you've opened yourself to the fact that if they're here more than 6 months, the permanent establishment rules kick in, which is global process whereby the foreign company is deemed to have a permanent establishment and earning income in Vietnam because they've got an individual doing things with authority and exercising authority. And if that's the case, you can be taxed on worldwide income in Vietnam, and you may not have the deduction. That's the foreign entity can be taxed in Vietnam. So you can bring your international income and international expenses, sort of the whole thing, to Vietnam by accident, simply by having an individual here not employed correctly through the proper structure. So there are quite a number of risks. We've seen both. And when the authorities inspect, we've seen them can be pragmatic, but they do, even if they do accept and go through a process whereby someone was not in compliance, it will never happen. You know that it'll never let it happen again. So there is, it can be a light touch. We've also seen the alternate where they have ejected people, blacklisted, fined, penalised, and very deliberate, debilitating for a business.
And you mentioned before about taxes. Generally, the employer is responsible to pay taxes on behalf of the employee in Vietnam based on the labor contract and the work permit. How do these work in practice?
So the employer withholds taxes on behalf of the employee and remits it and reports on that. So the employer is required to pay certain insurances on top of the salary and withhold insurances and taxes from the employee on their behalf and remit. So they're responsible for doing that. If they do not, there's an obligation on the employer. And so there is that onus on the employer to understand what they're doing and report and remit and make sure they are compliant. And so if one of the inspection processes is adding up all the salaries, watching what's going out, looking at taxes, looking at labour contracts, if they're not adding up, if something's not happening, there's your exposure, and that's an easy task. That's just the numerical process of what was paid, what's being withheld. So if you have got an individual that you're not paying taxes because they're foreign and you don't have a work permit or try to hide them, they'll go through and they'll see that. If you're treating as an employee, you're caught straight away. If you're not treating as an employee, you're still going to be caught, but the process is quite transparent because it is a reporting and a reconciliation process. Keep in mind, in Vietnam, expenses need to have a VAT invoice or their labour, or there's a small other categories there. But if it's not an expense with an invoice, if they're treated as labour, where's my deductions? Where's my withholdings? Where's my income tax and insurances? If I don't have that, they stand out, absolutely stand out. So it's very hard to get past that. And the responsibility to remit taxes does protect, from an inspection perspective, the inspector to see what's happening.
One of the questions we often hear from foreign employees mostly is about potential benefits looking at the Social Security Fund or pension fund in Vietnam. Some of them, they worked in Singapore, in Malaysia, and over there they have they call them the Provident Fund or different types of arrangements for the foreign employees to actually have that benefit almost as a local worker. Is there something in law in Vietnam as well?
So foreign employees within pay everything except for unemployment insurance. They're treated as the same as a local, except they're not entitled to unemployment insurance if they lose their job. That's out of the system. But if they're sick, they've got the health insurance, they've got the maternity leave. If you're employed and have a baby, you actually are paid. There's a reduced amount, but there is a contribution to paying you whilst 6 months after giving birth or thereabouts. If you're sick, if you have an accident, you're covered. The system does cover. The other part is the pension. So a portion of those payments that the employer or employee makes goes to the pension scheme. The pension scheme is for Vietnamese that have worked for 20 years, anyone in Vietnam who's worked for 20 years is entitled to a claim for the rest of their life out of the pension fund. If a foreign individual departs Vietnam permanently, they can apply to get whatever they've put in back out, so that if they're here for 3 years, contribute for 3 years, they can withdraw. That's only been in place for this year. So 2022 is the first year that is applied. We are seeing withdrawals. It does happen. It's process going through, but there are forms and there is a process with the authorities to make a claim. So if you have not been here 20 years contributing, and given most people it's impossible with more than 1 year for an expat, we'll see in 20 years how that works out. But it's just an extension to the local system, which does work and people do get their benefits. So if you're not going to reside here, you can claim and take out the contributions and when you leave Vietnam.
You've been here almost 20 years. You have 18 years already.
Almost, yeah.
You can retire after 20 years?
No, because the schemes only come in from this year. So this is my first year of contribution.
Right.
Vlad, I'm no different to yourself. You've been here a number of years, but from a pension retirement fund perspective, we're treated exactly the same.
Right. And actually, with these days, you're actually applying for your permanent resident card renewal as well, right? Can you share a few details about what it means for a foreign employee looking at temporary resident card and potentially permanent resident card as well? How do these work?
Permanent resident cards, there's not many around. It's for those who are married, have a house, reside, being here for a number of years. So there's a process for that, and it's not overly complicated, but there's a process. What a temporary resident card is what the bulk of people exist on, and that is in lieu of a visa. So you can have a visa, which is a stamp in your passport, or electronic visa for short-term 30-day visits. The temporary resident card is a card that is like a local ID. And it allows you to use that card for travel and for accommodation and for registering. It shows that you have immigrated correctly, you have a right to be here, and you don't need, in most cases, your passport to attach to it. The card gives you that right. And that's a multi-entry. Any port, any entry in and out of the country, and it is that freedom for travel. A visa can give you the same rights, but is attached to your passport. It's not a separate document and a separate ID. And I would encourage those. A temporary resident card gives much more flexibility. That's the expectation by the authorities, banks, etc. It just gives you that flexibility and gives you that comfort. And that is an entitlement. So if you're an investor in a company with more than $130,000 US put into a company yourself, if you have a work permit, or a number of situations, you are entitled to a temporary resident card. Or if you're married to a Vietnamese, you're entitled to a temporary resident card, and that gives you that ability. With that, you can go and buy a motorbike or a car in your name, you can get driver's licenses, etc., etc.
And looking towards 2023, do you see any potential changes looking at the processes, procedures for employing foreign experts into Vietnam, the entire process that we talked about? Do you see authorities are listening a bit more to the chambers of commerce that are trying to simplify the process and streamline it?
Well, my expectations versus, I haven't heard anything, my expectations based upon what is happening is that we will see a formalised approach to disconnect the university degree specifics from the role. So there is always the argument that Bill Gates can't be employed in Vietnam because he doesn't have a degree, or someone doesn't have a degree relevant to the role. That is a sort of bugbear, and as I said, you can work around that somewhat, but it is still there. And so I don't see them removing the university degree as a requirement, but I see them being more pragmatic. We saw that during the COVID, the Prime Minister issued directive to accept a broader range. I think we'll see that legislated so that there is a broader interpretation of degree, not necessarily relevant to the role. Second thing is that I'm expecting a more flexible visa strategy in 2023 to revert back to the way the law is written, so the sort of this COVID restrictions. It may not be the same because they've discovered e-visas and electronic visas are actually not a bad thing to do electronically and not having to wait in queues and send passports to the embassies, etc. So how they implement that and whether they go further and deeper and do business visas and invitations fully electronically and skip the stickers is something that I think we'll see next year in that will evolve and will move back more on the digital dependency. And just as an aside, the embassies, if you go to an embassy and ask about visas, they go, no, don't exist, can't do it. They're in denial about every embassy that I'm aware of, Vietnamese embassy abroad, that the electronic visa system works to enter. They're only 30 days and they are technically tourist visas, but that flexibility of just applying, using it, getting it and not involving embassy, you can see that they're not particularly happy about that because they're not getting any income. And it's interesting, the evolution of what that will bring us in the business space, and hopefully that simplifies and makes much easier for that process for inviting and bringing parties over through that fully electronic process.
And as a final question, you mentioned evolution. How did the opportunities that you see for foreign special skilled workers in Vietnam evolved maybe during COVID and after COVID as well? Do you see a change? Do you see a sustained market opportunities for foreign experts to come into Vietnam?
Let me answer in two parts. One is we're seeing an influx of interest now into Vietnam. The influx is there, partly because Vietnam doesn't have any hard limits. There's no limits on the number of foreign employees. Is there a need? You don't have the work pass, employment pass issues in Singapore where there's restrictions and quotas and it's very hard to get it. In Thailand, a 4-to-1, or other countries, certain companies can or can't employ foreigners. A lot of these that can't meet the requirements or are not as happy. Vietnam looks simple. It is a lot more flexible. So there's hard limits, makes Vietnam go, oh, maybe I can work in Vietnam. So we're seeing a lot of that. Back to the specific question. So as much as that looks attractive and Vietnam looks much more open and pragmatic than many countries, the reality is that senior roles, international leadership roles, yes, Vietnam, if moving around, taking a head of a foreign organization, those roles exist and they're quite specialist roles and they're quite sort of global roles and moving around. That mid-level that was 15 years ago hired to build the capacity in Vietnam and bring that mid-level over here, not so much. You need to have a specific skill that is useful or a cultural understanding that can bring in and just simply go, oh, I want to work in Vietnam. There is not a lot of those opportunities. They're there, but it's not just, I want to work in Vietnam, I'll go get a job. The Vietnamese middle management, I've had her spoken 15 years ago and said the biggest gap in Vietnam is middle management. Vietnam had it there. It is still challenging, but that's there. There is a significant level of international experience in Vietnamese middle management that does not require the bulk level of foreigners that would obviously come over at that middle level and progress up. So it creates a challenge. The demand, the wants there, the restrictions are theoretically far less than other countries, but does the country need, and can you prove to the authorities that you can't actually get an Vietnamese to do those jobs? It's not just sort of a simple equation anymore. So to finish that, opportunities, yes. Need, maybe. But to anyone watching this, if you are thinking about it, what skill, what relevance to market do you have? Because there are plenty others in country have skills and relevance, and it is not just a simple, I want to work in Vietnam. This is what I have that's useful for Vietnam or Vietnamese businesses.
Matthew, thank you again for your great insights and your practical experience, especially because you've been here, as you said, almost 20 years, and you've seen quite a lot looking at the foreign investor side and as well on the employer side.
Fantastic, great to talk, and hopefully this was helpful to viewers.
Employment and labor compliance in Vietnam is an area that can cause confusion and uncertainty to foreign investors entering and operating in country. Moreover, employing foreign experts comes with additional compliance requirements, which should be carefully assessed in order to ensure employment process is efficient, compliant, and legal. Thank you. And many thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning into Advancing Vietnam podcast series. For more information about this topic, please check out our publications on vietnam.acline.com. And if you want to reach out to us for any additional details, feel free to contact me on LinkedIn or throughout the website contact details.